The wind howled through the bare trees, whipping the snow into sharp little flurries that stung my face. I stood at the front door, clutching Oliver against my chest, trying to shield him from the biting cold. His tiny head rested against my shoulder, his breathing soft and steady, blissfully unaware of the storm that was unraveling around us. Behind me, Alesta Petrovna's voice echoed through the open doorway like a knife cutting through the frigid air. "Out," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "I want you out of this house with that child. You think you can just stay here forever, living off me? Think again." She stood there, tall and imposing, her face twisted in satisfaction as if she relished every syllable she hurled at me. Her gray eyes narrowed with a cruel gleam, and her lips curled into a sneer. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat felt tight, but it wasn't from the cold. It was from the rage that was building inside me, simmering beneath the surface. I tightened my grip on Oliver, holding him closer to me, trying to draw strength from his warmth. Behind her, George stood silently near the window, his arms crossed, staring at the ground like a child caught in the middle of a quarrel he didn't want to be part of. He had always been like this, quiet, passive, afraid to stand up to his mother. I had waited for him to say something, to defend me, to defend our family, but once again, there was only silence. I looked at him, my eyes pleading for some kind of intervention. "George," my voice cracked as I called his name. He finally glanced up, meeting my eyes for just a moment before looking away again. The same helpless expression I'd seen so many times before. He opened his mouth to say something, but nothing came out. His shoulders sagged, and he turned back to the window, as if what was happening didn't concern him at all. "George." I called again, louder this time. "You're really just going to stand there? Say something." But he didn't. He couldn't. His loyalty was as frozen as the world outside, locked away in fear of his mother. Alesta laughed, an ugly, bitter sound. "He's not going to help you, Ava. He knows his place. And so should you. Now get out of my house. I don't want to see your face here again." I felt the weight of her words press down on me, but instead of breaking, I straightened my back. This wasn't her house. I turned toward her, locking eyes with Alesta. My voice was calm, steady. "This house doesn't belong to you, Alesta. It never did." For a moment, her smug expression faltered, and confusion flashed across her face. I could see the wheels turning in her head as she processed what I had said. "This house belongs to me," I continued, my words measured. "My grandmother left it to me, and that's something you forgot." Alesta's eyes whitened slightly, but she quickly recovered, scoffing as if my words were meaningless. "You think that matters? I don't care what some piece of paper says. You're not welcome here." I took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill my lungs, and then I looked around, at the walls that had once felt like home, now suffocating under the weight of this conflict. But this wasn't over. Not yet. "I'll leave," I said softly, adjusting Oliver in my arms. "But I'll be back, and when I do, it won't be on your terms." Alesta huffed, crossing her arms in front of her chest. "Go ahead. I dare you. You won't last a day without us." I didn't answer her. Instead, I turned away, walking toward the snow-covered driveway. Each step felt heavier than the last, but with every step I took, something inside me shifted. I wasn't running. I wasn't being driven out. This was my choice now, and that made all the difference. As I reached the edge of the driveway, I glanced back one last time. George was still standing by the window, his eyes downcast, lost in his own silence. He didn't move, didn't wave, didn't say a word. I pulled Oliver closer, kissing the top of his head. "We'll be fine, sweetheart," I whispered into his soft curls. "We'll be just fine." And for the first time in a long while, I believed it. It wasn't always like this. I still remember the first time I met Alesta Petrovna, when George brought me to his childhood home for dinner. Back then, I was nervous, hopeful even. I wanted her to like me, to approve of me as the woman her son had chosen. Alesta opened the door with a polite smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. I brushed it off at the time. Maybe she was just reserved. Maybe she just needed time to warm up to me. Her house smelled of fresh bread and roasted meat, a cozy, welcoming scent that seemed to contradict the tension I felt as soon as I stepped inside. I clung to George's arm, hoping the awkwardness would fade. "Welcome, Ava," Alesta had said, her voice smooth but lacking warmth. "George has told me so much about you." "Thank you, Alesta Petrovna," I replied, offering her a tentative smile. I wanted so badly for this to go well. "Just Alesta is fine, dear," she said, though her tone felt rehearsed, as if she was playing the part of the gracious host out of duty rather than sincerity. Dinner that night was filled with polite conversation. Alesta asking questions about my job, my family, my future plans with George. But there was something underneath her words, a subtle sharpness that made me uneasy. It was as if she was probing for weaknesses, testing how well I would fit into the world she had created around her son. At the time, I didn't see it for what it was. I was too focused on making a good impression. George, as usual, didn't seem to notice anything. He chatted with his mother as if everything was perfectly normal, completely oblivious to the tension that simmered just beneath the surface. After dinner, as George and I were leaving, Alesta pulled me aside in the hallway. "You seem like a nice girl, Ava," she said softly, her hand resting lightly on my arm. "But I hope you understand that George is very special. He's been through a lot, and it's important that you take care of him. He needs a woman who knows how to support him, how to make him the priority in her life." Her words stung, but I smiled and nodded, not knowing what else to say. "Of course," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. On the drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just been tested. I looked over at George, who was humming along to the radio, completely unaware of the conversation I'd just had with his mother. "George," I said, hesitating for a moment, "do you think your mom likes me?" He glanced at me, surprised by the question. "Of course she does. Why wouldn't she?" I shrugged, trying to play it off. "I don't know. I just got the feeling that maybe she's not sure about me." He laughed, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "You're overthinking it. She's always like that with new people. She'll warm up to you. Just give her time." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But as the months passed, Alesta's subtle critiques became more frequent. She started coming over more often, just to help out, she would say, but her help always came with comments that chipped away at my confidence. "Ava, you really should cook dinner for George more often. You know how much he likes a home-cooked meal. Are you sure you want to wear that? George has always preferred more traditional styles. I noticed you didn't fold the laundry the way I showed you. George likes his shirts done a certain way." It wasn't outright hostile, at least not at first, but it was constant, this gentle but relentless pressure to be the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect everything for George. One evening, after another round of backhanded compliments from Alesta, I finally turned to George. "Does she think I'm not good enough for you?" I asked, the frustration clear in my voice. George looked up from his book, startled. "What? No, of course not." "Then why does she keep telling me how to do everything?" I asked, my voice rising. "Every time she's here, she has something to say about what I should be doing differently, how I'm not doing things right. It's like she's trying to mold me into someone I'm not." George sighed and set his book down. "She's just trying to help, Ava. She means well." "Help," I repeated, incredulous. "Telling me I don't cook enough for you, that I don't dress the way you like, that I can't even fold laundry properly. That's not helping, George. That's controlling." He rubbed his temples, clearly tired of the conversation. "You're overreacting. She's just set in her ways. Don't take it so personally." I stared at him, the hurt bubbling up in my chest. Why can't you see what she's doing? She's undermining me, George. Every day, little by little. George stood up, walking toward the door. I don't want to fight about this, Ava. She's my mother. She's just trying to look out for me. Can't you just try a little harder to get along with her? And there it was, the beginning of the divide. The gap between what I felt and what George refused to see. It was then that I realized I was on my own in this. Alesta wasn't just a mother-in-law trying to be helpful. She was trying to mold me, control me, and George's loyalty to her was stronger than anything I could say. It was a rainy afternoon when the letter arrived, a nondescript envelope addressed to me in delicate, familiar handwriting. The moment I saw it, my heart skipped a beat. It was from the lawyer handling my grandmother's estate. She had passed away just a week before, and everything had felt like a blur. Grief mixed with the daily struggle of caring for baby Oliver and managing life with George and Alesta Petrovna constantly hovering. I sat down at the kitchen table, the sound of rain pattering against the windows, and carefully opened the envelope. As I unfolded the letter, my hands trembled. I wasn't sure what to expect. The words on the page blurred for a moment as my eyes filled with tears. My grandmother, the only true family I'd ever had left me her house. Our house. The one I had grown up visiting every summer, the one filled with memories of warmth, love, and her quiet wisdom. And now, it was mine. I sat there, stunned, letting the realization sink in. The house wasn't large, but it was a part of me, a piece of my past that I had never expected to hold onto. It felt like a gift from her, a way of telling me I wasn't alone. I barely had time to process this when the front door creaked open. George walked in, shaking off the rain from his jacket. He noticed the letter in my hand and frowned. "What's that?" he asked, dropping his keys on the counter. "It's from the lawyer," I replied quietly, still staring at the paper in my hands. "Grandma left me the house." George's eyebrows shot up. "The house? Really?" "Yes." I nodded, a mix of disbelief and excitement creeping into my voice. "She left it to me." He sat down across from me, looking thoughtful. "That's unexpected. I mean, I knew she had that house, but I didn't think she'd leave it to you." "Why not?" I asked, suddenly feeling defensive. "She didn't have anyone else. I was the only one she had left." George held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I didn't mean it like that. It's just a lot to take in." I leaned back in my chair, the weight of the inheritance suddenly feeling heavier. "Yeah, it is. But it's also, it feels like a piece of her is still with me, you know." He nodded, but his expression was distant, as if his mind was already elsewhere. I could tell he was calculating something, thinking about the practicalities rather than the sentiment. And in the pit of my stomach, I knew what would come next. A few days later, Alesta Petrovna found out. She had come over for one of her usual visits. Oliver cradled in her arms as she cooed at him in that sing-song voice that always made me feel invisible. I was in the middle of folding laundry when George casually mentioned the inheritance. "By the way, Mom," he said, looking up from the newspaper. "Ava's grandmother left her the house. We're thinking about what to do with it." Alesta froze mid-bounce, her eyes narrowing as she processed the information. She gently set Oliver down in his playpen and turned to me. "The house?" she asked, her voice deceptively sweet. "You didn't mention that, Ava." I swallowed hard, already sensing the shift in her demeanor. "I just found out a few days ago. I was still figuring out what to do with it." "Figuring out?" Alesta repeated, her tone sharp now. "What's there to figure out? You should move in immediately. Sell this place, get out from under the mortgage, and live comfortably in the house that's fully paid for." I blinked, taken aback by how quickly she was jumping to conclusions. I hadn't thought that far ahead yet. Alesta crossed her arms, her eyes fixed on me with that familiar look of superiority. It's the obvious choice. You can finally stop struggling, and we can help fix the place up. Maybe even sell my apartment and combine everything to make it more modern. I opened my mouth to protest, but George chimed in, his voice neutral. Mom's got a point, Ava. It would make sense. I stared at him, incredulous. You want me to sell the house? Not sell it, no, he said quickly. Just think about how much easier things could be. We could all move in together and... All of us? I interrupted, my voice rising. You mean you and me and Oliver, and your mother? Alesta smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Of course. I've done so much for you both. It would only be right for us to live together, like a proper family. I've helped raise Oliver, after all. I stood up, my hands shaking. This wasn't what my grandmother intended. That house is my home, mine, and Oliver's. It's not for you to take over. Alesta's smile faded, replaced by a steely glare. You wouldn't have the luxury of that house if it weren't for my support. Don't forget who's been here all these months, holding everything together. I could feel my pulse quicken, my breath coming faster as the weight of her manipulation pressed down on me. This isn't about support, Alesta. This is about control. You can't control me, and you can't control that house. Her eyes flashed with anger, and for a moment, I thought she might lash out. But instead, she took a step back, her voice cold. Fine. Do what you want. But don't come crying to me when you realize how hard it is to manage everything on your own. George looked between us, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to take a side. Let's not turn this into a fight, okay? We're just talking things through. But we weren't just talking. The lines had been drawn, and I knew then that this inheritance was going to be a battleground. Alesta wasn't going to let go of her grip so easily, and I would have to fight to keep the house, and my independence, intact. As she left the room, I slumped back into my chair, feeling the weight of the future pressing down on me. This wasn't just about a house. This was about my freedom, my ability to make choices for myself and for Oliver. And Alesta wasn't about to let me have that without a fight. I glanced over at George, who was staring at the floor, avoiding my gaze. Are you going to say anything? I asked quietly. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know what you want me to say, Ava. She's just trying to help. I shook my head, my voice barely a whisper. This isn't help, George. It's control, and I won't let her take that house from me. The tension in the house grew heavier with each passing day. Alesta Petrovna's passive-aggressive comments became sharper, and George's silence became more deafening. Every evening, I braced myself for another onslaught of criticisms wrapped in thinly veiled suggestions. But what hurt more than her words was George's refusal to acknowledge what was happening. I knew he loved me, but his loyalty to his mother ran deep. It was as if he was caught between us, unable or unwilling to see how much her influence was suffocating our marriage. One evening, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at framed photos on the wall, pictures of happier times, when George and I were still in the honeymoon phase, when Oliver was a newborn and Alesta had seemed to genuinely help. But now, things were different. Alesta wasn't just a helpful presence. She had inserted herself into every aspect of our lives. The house felt colder, emptier, despite the fact that she was always there. I was folding Oliver's clothes when George walked in, looking distracted. He tossed his jacket onto the back of a chair and glanced at me. Hey, he said, his voice casual, as if nothing was wrong. How was your day? I gave him a weak smile, not in the mood for small talk. It was fine. Oliver napped for a while, so I had some time to clean up. Good, he muttered, pulling out his phone and scrolling absent-mindedly. He didn't even look at me, and that small act of dismissal ignited a spark of frustration in my chest. I took a deep breath, trying to hold back my anger. George, I said quietly, setting down the baby clothes. We need to talk. He looked up, his brow furrowing slightly. About what? About your mother, I replied, my voice steady but firm. George sighed, leaning back in his chair. Ava, not this again. She's not trying to hurt you. That's not the point, I said, my frustration bubbling to the surface. She's undermining me, George, every single day. She treats me like I'm a child who doesn't know how to run my own life. And you just sit there and let it happen. His eyes narrowed, clearly not liking where this conversation was headed. I'm not letting anything happen. She's just helping. I interrupted, my voice rising. That's what you always say. But George, it's not help when she's constantly telling me what to do, how to raise Oliver, how to live my life. And now with the house, she's trying to take control of that too. He rubbed his temples, clearly growing tired of the argument. Ava, you're overreacting. It's not like she's trying to take the house from you. She's just suggesting ways we can make things easier. Easier for her, I shot back. Not for me. She wants to move in, George. She wants to run the house like it's hers. And I can't live like that. For a moment, he said nothing, just stared at me with that same look of exasperation. What do you want me to do, Ava? He asked finally, his voice low. She's my mother. I can't just kick her out of our lives. I'm not asking you to kick her out, I said, my voice softening. I'm asking you to stand up for me, to tell her that this is our life, our house, and she doesn't get to control everything. George sighed again, running a hand through his hair. It's not that simple. It is that simple, I insisted. But you're choosing not to see it. His silence in that moment spoke louder than any words. I could feel the sting of betrayal settling deep in my chest. George wasn't just being passive. He was making a choice. He was choosing her. Choosing to stay silent, to avoid conflict, and in doing so, he was abandoning me. The next day, everything came to a head. I was in the living room, playing with Oliver, when I overheard George and his mother talking in the kitchen. Their voices were low, but I could make out snippets of the conversation. Just worried about Ava. She's been so stressed lately, George said, his voice quiet. Of course she's stressed, Alesta replied, her tone filled with mock sympathy. But she's not handling things well. The house is a lot for her to manage on her own. You should have her let me help more. I clenched my fists, already knowing where this was going. George hesitated. I think she's starting to feel like you're overstepping. There was a long pause before Alesta's voice cut through the silence, sharp and cold. Overstepping. I've done nothing but help you both, George. I sold my apartment for this family, and now she's acting like I'm some kind of intruder. You're not an intruder, Mom. But what? Alesta snapped. She can't even manage a simple household without getting overwhelmed. I'm just trying to make things easier, but if she wants to act like I'm the problem, maybe you should remind her who's really been keeping this family together. I stood there, frozen in place, anger bubbling up inside me. It wasn't just the words that hurt, but the fact that George wasn't defending me. Again. I walked into the kitchen, unable to listen anymore. Both of them looked up as I entered, surprise flashing across their faces. You don't need to remind me, Alesta, I said, my voice trembling with barely restrained anger. I know exactly what you've done for this family, but don't mistake that for control over my life. This house is mine, not yours. Alesta's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a smirk. Is that so? And what are you going to do, Ava? Kick me out? I've been here since the beginning, helping with Oliver, keeping this place running while you've struggled. I never asked for your help, I replied, my voice cold. And I'm not going to let you take over my life. You may have George wrapped around your finger, but you don't own me. I turned to George, hoping, praying, that he would finally stand by me. But all he did was stare at the floor, silent. And in that moment, the truth hit me like a cold slap. George wasn't going to fight for me. He wasn't going to stand up to his mother. He had made his choice, and it wasn't me. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the kitchen, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence. I felt like I was walking through a fog, the realization sinking deeper with each step. This was my life now, a silent betrayal that hung between us, unspoken but undeniable. George wasn't my partner anymore. He was just a passive observer, unwilling to stand up to the one person who was driving a wedge between us. And Alesta knew it. As the days went on, the tension in the house became unbearable. Alesta Petrovna continued to assert her dominance over every aspect of my life, and George, as always, stayed silent. The air was thick with resentment, and it felt like every room in the house was filled with the echoes of unspoken battles. Alesta was relentless. Every morning, I would wake up to find her already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast as if it were her right. She acted as though she was the head of the household, taking charge of everything from grocery shopping to how the furniture was arranged. Each time, she made a decision without consulting me. It felt like a small cut, slowly chipping away at my sense of control. I tried to stand my ground, but it was like playing a game of chess where she was always 10 moves ahead, anticipating every defense I put up. One afternoon, I was cleaning the living room when I heard her voice from the kitchen. "Ava, you're doing it wrong again," she called out, her tone dripping with condescension. "That tablecloth is too light for this season. You need something darker for fall." I clenched my fists around the cloth, biting my tongue. This wasn't about the tablecloth. It was about her constant need to undermine me, to remind me that in her eyes, I was never good enough. "I think it looks fine, Alesta," I replied, keeping my voice calm. "Fine? It looks ridiculous," she shot back, walking into the room with her arms crossed. "You need to learn how to manage a home properly, Ava. If you don't start taking this seriously, things will fall apart." I took a deep breath and straightened up, meeting her gaze. "I'm managing just fine, thank you." Her eyes narrowed, a smirk playing at the corners of her lips. "Really? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're barely keeping things together. If it weren't for me, this house would be a disaster." There it was again, that sense of superiority, that belief that she was the glue holding everything together. And the worst part was, she believed it. I wasn't about to let her walk all over me anymore. I had been quiet for too long, but I wasn't going to be pushed aside in my own home. "This house belongs to me, Alesta," I said firmly, my voice gaining strength. "And I'll decide how to manage it. You may have sold your apartment, but that doesn't give you the right to take over everything. I didn't ask for your help." Alesta's smirk disappeared, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. She stepped closer, her voice low and sharp. "You ungrateful girl. If it weren't for me, you'd be lost. George and I built this life for you, and you repay me by disrespecting me in my own son's house." "Your son's house," I repeated, my heart pounding. "This is my house, Alesta. I inherited it. You didn't buy it, and you don't control what happens here." Alesta's face hardened, and for a moment, I thought she might lash out, but instead, she simply smiled. A thin, venomous smile. "You think you can hold this over me because you inherited the house?" she asked, her voice dripping with disdain. "Inheritance means nothing if you don't know how to run a household. You can have the title, Ava, but that doesn't mean you have the power." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I didn't flinch. I wasn't going to back down. I had spent too long letting her dominate me, letting her twist every situation to her advantage. I squared my shoulders, refusing to show any weakness. "I have the power because this is my home, and I'm not going to let you take that away from me." We stood there in silence for a few moments, the tension between us crackling like a live wire. I could see the anger simmering just beneath the surface of her calm facade, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to let her manipulate me any longer. Just then, George walked into the room, looking between the two of us with confusion. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice cautious. Alesta immediately softened, her demeanor shifting in an instant. "Oh, nothing, dear," she said sweetly. "Ava and I were just having a little disagreement about the house." George sighed, clearly uncomfortable. "Again, can't we just, I don't know, find a way to get along?" I looked at him, incredulous. "George, this isn't about getting along. Your mother is trying to take control of everything, and I'm not going to let that happen." Alesta's eyes flicked to George, her expression full of wounded innocence. "George, I'm only trying to help. Ava doesn't understand how much work goes into keeping a house like this running smoothly." George rubbed the back of his neck, clearly torn. "Mom, maybe you could give Ava some space. This is her house, after all." It wasn't much, but it was something. A small acknowledgement of my position. But Alesta wasn't going to give up that easily. "Space," she repeated, her voice icy. "George, I sold my apartment and moved in here for the sake of this family. I've done everything I can to support you both, and now you're asking me to step back. After everything I've sacrificed." I could see George waver, caught between us once again. But before he could say anything, I stepped forward, refusing to let her guilt him into submission. "Alesta, we appreciate everything you've done," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "But this is my home, and I need to be able to run it the way I see fit. That's not disrespect, it's just reality." Alesta's eyes flashed with anger, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked out of the room, leaving George and me standing in the silence. George sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This is getting out of hand, Ava." "I know," I said quietly. "But I can't keep living like this, George. I need you to back me up." He looked at me, his face filled with uncertainty. "I'll try, Ava. I'll try." But even as he said the words, I could tell they were hollow. The power struggle between Alesta and me was far from over, and George was still too afraid to pick a side. As I watched him walk out of the room, I realized that this wasn't just about control over the house anymore. It was about control over my life, my future, and my family. And I wasn't going to let Alesta win. The tension in the house had reached a breaking point. What had once been subtle power plays between Alesta Petrovna and me had now turned into an open war of dominance, with George caught helplessly in the middle. Every day felt like walking on eggshells, and each small disagreement only widened the cracks in our fragile family dynamic. Oliver, now a few months old, was the only thing keeping me grounded. His innocent laughter and tiny hands gripping mine reminded me why I was fighting so hard. I wasn't just protecting myself. I was fighting for him, for the home and stability he deserved. But Alesta wasn't making it easy. One evening, I was in the kitchen preparing dinner, when I overheard a conversation between George and his mother in the next room. I wasn't eavesdropping intentionally, but their raised voices carried through the thin walls. "You can't keep doing this, Mom," George said, his frustration evident. "Ava is trying her best, and you're making everything harder." Making everything harder. Alesta's voice was sharp. "I'm the one holding this family together. If it weren't for me, this house would be in shambles. Ava doesn't know how to manage anything properly. She's too young and inexperienced." I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the kitchen counter. This wasn't the first time I'd heard her criticize me, but hearing it from George's mother, spoken so casually as if it were an undeniable truth, still stung. "Mom, that's not fair," George replied, but there was hesitation in his voice. "She's doing fine. She's learning." "Learning?" Alesta scoffed. "She's had months, George. If she hasn't learned by now, she never will. And don't forget, I sold my apartment to help you both. You owe me." George's voice grew quieter. "I know, Mom. I know you've done a lot, but..." But nothing, she interrupted. You're my son. You should be on my side in this, not hers. I felt a surge of anger bubble up inside me. George had promised to back me up, to stand by me when it came to dealing with his mother. But now, it was clear that his loyalties were torn, and it hurt more than I was willing to admit. A moment later, George walked into the kitchen, his expression conflicted. He saw the look on my face and hesitated. You heard that, didn't you? He asked softly. I didn't trust myself to speak, so I just nodded. George sighed, running a hand through his hair. Ava, she doesn't mean it. She's stressed. She doesn't mean it. I repeated, my voice low but full of disbelief. George, she's been saying the same things for months. She thinks I'm incompetent, and you never tell her otherwise. You just stand there and let her talk down to me. He looked down, guilt flickering in his eyes. I'm trying, Ava. It's not that simple. It is that simple, I said, my voice rising. You need to choose, George. Are you going to stand by me, your wife, or let her keep controlling everything in our lives? His silence was deafening. He was torn between the two women in his life, his mother and me, and the indecision was slowly tearing us apart. I turned away from him, focusing on the stove, but I couldn't hold back the wave of emotions crashing over me. I can't keep doing this, George. I can't keep fighting both of you. Both of us. He stepped closer, confused. Yes, both of you, I said, turning back to face him, my eyes stinging with unshed tears. Every time you don't stand up for me, every time you let her undermine me, you're choosing her over me. And it's breaking me. George's face fell, and for the first time, I saw real regret in his eyes. Ava, I don't want to lose you. I'm trying to keep the peace. At what cost? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Because I'm not sure how much more I can take. The next morning, Alesta escalated things further. I was feeding Oliver in the living room when she marched in, holding a pile of bills in her hand. Ava, we need to talk, she said briskly, dropping the papers onto the coffee table. I glanced at the bills, confused. What is this? It's the electricity, the water, the repairs we've had done to the roof. All of these expenses are piling up, and I've been the one handling them. I frowned. George and I have been paying the bills. We've always contributed. Alesta waved a hand dismissively. Oh, please. Whatever little contribution you've made is nothing compared to what I've been covering. If I hadn't sold my apartment, you wouldn't even be able to keep this house in one piece. There it was again, the constant reminder that she had sold her apartment for us, as if that gave her complete control over everything. I appreciate what you've done, Alesta, I said, trying to stay calm. But that doesn't mean you get to run everything. This is still my house, and I'm capable of managing it. She snorted. Capable. I've seen how you manage things. You're barely keeping your head above water. I could feel my patience wearing thin. What do you want, Alesta? What is this really about? She crossed her arms, her gaze cold. I want you to realize that you need me. You can't do this without me, no matter how much you want to pretend otherwise. I stood up, cradling Oliver against my chest. I don't need you, Alesta. I've been managing just fine without your constant interference. Her eyes flashed with anger, and she stepped closer, lowering her voice to a venomous whisper. You think you're so strong, Ava, but you're not. You're weak. And the sooner you realize that, the better off this family will be. I stared at her, stunned by the sheer cruelty in her words. For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. But then, a calm determination settled over me. I may be struggling, I said softly, but I'm not weak. I've survived more than you know, and I won't let you break me. Alesta's lips curled into a sneer, but she didn't say another word. She turned on her heel and stormed out of the room, leaving me standing there, clutching Oliver as tears of frustration and exhaustion welled in my eyes. The cracks in our family were growing wider with each passing day, and I wasn't sure how much longer the fragile structure could hold. The tension that had been building for months finally exploded one evening. It was late, and Oliver was already asleep in his crib, his tiny chest rising and falling peacefully, unaware of the storm brewing just outside his nursery. I stood in the kitchen, washing the last of the dishes, trying to find some semblance of calm in the mundane task. But I could feel it coming, the confrontation I had been avoiding for far too long. Alesta had become more brazen in her attempts to dominate the household, and George's passivity had only worsened. I had tried to be patient, to keep the peace for Oliver's sake, but I knew deep down that it couldn't continue like this. Something had to give. The sound of Alesta's sharp heels clicking against the wooden floor filled the air before she appeared in the doorway, her face set in a familiar expression of disdain. "We need to talk, Ava," she announced, her voice cold and authoritative. I dried my hands, already bracing myself for what was about to happen. "What is it, Alesta?" She crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "This has gone on long enough. You think you can just waltz in here and take over? This is my son's house, my family's home, and you've done nothing but tear it apart." I took a deep breath, keeping my voice steady. "This is my home too, Alesta. You've never accepted that, and I'm tired of pretending otherwise." She let out a bitter laugh. "Your home. You wouldn't even have this house if it weren't for me. I sold my apartment. I've paid for repairs. I've kept this place afloat. And this is how you repay me?" I stepped closer, meeting her gaze head-on. "I've always been grateful for what you've done, but that doesn't give you the right to control everything. You've used your financial help as a weapon against me, and I'm done with it." Alesta's eyes flared with anger, but before she could respond, George appeared in the doorway. His face was pale, and his eyes darted between us, sensing the gravity of the moment. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice low but tense. I turned to him, my heart pounding in my chest. "It's time we settled this once and for all, George. I can't keep living like this, with your mother constantly undermining me in my own home." George looked at his mother, then back at me, visibly torn. "Ava, I don't want to fight. Can't we all just find a way to get along?" Alesta scoffed. "Get along? She's been disrespecting me from the start. She doesn't appreciate anything I've done for this family." I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, but I forced myself to remain calm. "I've never disrespected you, Alesta. But I'm done letting you walk all over me. This house belongs to me, and it's time you accept that." Her eyes widened in shock, then narrowed with fury. You think you're in charge here because of some piece of paper. I made this house a home. You couldn't survive without me." I stood my ground, my voice steady and firm. "This isn't about survival. This is about boundaries, something you've never respected. I inherited this house from my grandmother, and while I appreciate the help you've given us, it doesn't mean you can control everything." George finally spoke up, his voice shaky. "Mom, maybe we should back off a little. Ava's right. This is her house, and we've been pushing too much." Alesta turned on him, her face flushed with rage. "Don't you dare side with her, George. After everything I've done for you, for your family, you're going to choose her over me?" George winced, clearly conflicted. "It's not about choosing sides, Mom. I love you, but I also love Ava. This has to stop. We can't keep fighting like this." Her lip curled in disdain, and she pointed a finger at me. "She's the reason everything is falling apart. She's driving a wedge between us, and you're too blind to see it." I couldn't stay silent any longer. "No, Alesta. This wedge has been here for a long time, ever since you decided that nothing I did would ever be good enough for you. You've been trying to control me since the day I moved in, and I'm done letting you." Alesta took a step closer, her voice dangerously low. "You think you've won, don't you? You think you can just push me out, like I'm nothing." I looked her straight in the eye. This isn't about winning. It's about standing up for myself and my family. You've crossed too many lines, and I won't let you keep doing it. There was a moment of silence, thick with tension, before Alesta finally spoke again, her voice dripping with bitterness. If you think I'm going to let you take my son away from me, you're wrong. George, still standing at the edge of the room, seemed to shrink under the weight of his mother's words. Mom, no one is taking me away from you. But we have to find a way to move forward without all this fighting. Alesta's eyes flicked to George, and for a moment, I saw something like desperation in her expression. You're my only son, George. Everything I've done has been for you, and this is how you repay me. George took a deep breath, his voice soft but resolute. I love you, Mom. But Ava is my wife, and this is her home. You have to stop trying to control everything. Alesta's face hardened, and she turned to me with a cold, calculating look. You'll regret this, Ava. Mark my words. I met her gaze, refusing to back down. I'm not afraid of you, Alesta. Not anymore. With that, she stormed out of the room, leaving an icy silence in her wake. George let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his temples as if trying to stave off an impending headache. I didn't want this to happen, he muttered, almost to himself. I walked over to him, my heart still pounding. George, I've been patient. I've tried to make this work, but it can't go on like this. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and exhaustion. I know, Ava. I'm sorry. I should have stood up to her sooner. I placed a hand on his arm, trying to offer him some comfort despite the anger simmering inside me. It's not too late, but we have to be united in this. If we're going to make it through, we need to set clear boundaries with her. George nodded slowly, as if the weight of the situation was finally sinking in. You're right. I'll talk to her again, but it's not going to be easy. I squeezed his arm gently. I know. But we can't keep living in this constant battle. For Oliver's sake, and for ours, we need to put an end to this. The final showdown had come, and while it wasn't a clean victory, it was the first step toward reclaiming our home, and our family, from Alesta's suffocating grip. I could only hope that George would hold firm, and that the cracks in our family wouldn't grow wider before they could be mended. The air in the house felt different now, lighter somehow, after the final confrontation with Alesta. She had left in a fit of anger, but her absence brought a strange sense of peace. The silence no longer carried the weight of tension. It felt like freedom. I walked through the rooms slowly, absorbing the quiet, as if it were a long-lost friend. Oliver was playing on the living room floor, babbling happily as he stacked his colorful blocks. His laughter filled the house, and for the first time in months, I felt like it truly belonged to us, to me and him. The shadow of Alesta's constant presence had lifted, and with it, the suffocating pressure of her control. George was at work, but I knew things wouldn't be the same between us for a while. We had a lot to rebuild: trust, communication, understanding, but I was hopeful. George had finally stood up for me, and though it had taken far too long, it was a start. For now, I focused on this new beginning, on the home I had fought so hard to protect. I sat down on the floor next to Oliver, brushing a lock of his soft hair from his forehead. He giggled and reached up to grab my hand, squeezing it with his tiny fingers. We did it, little one, I whispered, smiling at him. We've got our home back. Just then, the front door creaked open, and I turned to see George stepping inside. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped, but when he saw me and Oliver on the floor, a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. How's my little man? George asked, walking over and crouching down beside us. He gently ruffled Oliver's hair, who giggled in response, delighted by the attention. He's happy, I said softly. Happier than he's been in a while. George glanced at me, his expression a mix of relief and regret. Ava, I know things have been rough. I should have done more, sooner. I let this all go too far. I nodded, knowing this conversation was long overdue. You did, George. But you finally took a stand, and that means something. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I'm going to talk to her again. She's my mother, but she can't keep treating you, or us, like that. I'll make sure she understands. For the first time, I believed him. The hesitation that had plagued him before seemed to be gone, replaced by a quiet determination. I appreciate that, I said, my voice soft but firm. But I need you to really mean it this time, George. We can't go back to the way things were. I need to feel safe here, for Oliver's sake and for ours. He nodded, meeting my eyes. I do mean it, Ava. I promise. Things will be different. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words settling between us. It wasn't perfect. There were still scars from the months of conflict, but it was a start. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. Hope. As the days passed, the house became ours again. The constant friction that Alesta had brought with her was no longer suffocating our lives. I found myself redecorating, making small changes here and there that reflected who I was, not who she wanted me to be. I painted the kitchen a soft shade of blue, replaced the heavy drapes with light, airy curtains, and filled the living room with plants, something Alesta had always hated. One afternoon, as I was arranging a new set of photos on the mantelpiece, George walked in, carrying a small box. He looked hesitant but determined, a familiar mix of emotions I'd come to recognize. What's that? I asked, raising an eyebrow. He placed the box down on the coffee table and sat beside me. It's something I've been meaning to do for a while now. They're her things, my mom's. I think it's time we boxed them up. I looked at him, surprised. Are you sure? She's your mother, George. I know, he said quietly. But this is our home. It's time we started living like it. For a moment, I was speechless. The significance of his gesture wasn't lost on me. This was his way of showing me that he was committed to change, that he was ready to move forward. I nodded slowly. Okay, let's do it together. We spent the afternoon going through the remnants of Alesta's reign over our home, small things, like the stiff lace tablecloths she insisted on using, her heavy, ornate vases, and the pictures of her and George that lined the hallway. We boxed them up carefully, and George promised to take them to her the next time he visited. It felt like a cleansing, a way to reclaim the space that had been so tightly controlled for so long. As the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden light through the windows, I felt a sense of peace that had been absent for too long. I looked around at the house that was finally ours, and smiled. We're going to be okay, aren't we? I asked quietly, turning to George. He smiled back at me, his eyes soft with affection. Yeah, we are. That night, as I put Oliver to bed, I whispered a promise to him. Things will be different now, little one. We're going to build something better, something that's ours. I kissed his forehead and stood by the crib, watching him sleep. The storm had passed, and now, in its wake, I could see the beginnings of something new, a future built on our terms, free from the weight of Alesta's control. As I walked out of the nursery and into the living room, George was waiting for me, his arms open. I stepped into his embrace, feeling the warmth and strength of his presence. Together, we were starting a new chapter, one where we could finally breathe, where our family could grow without the shadow of the past. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was home, truly home,